I never imagined a being from another world would ask me to burn the last cash I owned. The violet light spilling from its eyes pressed against my thoughts like a foreign tide. It said, "What you hoard out of fear never multiplies." The room bent time seemed to fold, and my hands trembled as the fire ate the final bills. 3 days after that reckless ritual, $800,000 landed in my account. If I told you the universe answers backward to what you fear, would you listen? Or laugh me away? My name is Rafael Navarro. I'm 48, and I lived by columns and ledgers for most of my life. I learned to read balance sheets before I learned to read my own face. For 30 years I counted other people's fortunes while mine thinned like old paper. Mornings began with the same glass of bad coffee and a folder of unpaid notices. The apartment smelled faintly of dust and detergent. The radiator clicked on and off in the night like a patient, tired heart. I kept every receipt. I traced small sums with my thumb. Money doesn't grow on trees, my father used to say, like an incantation. That sentence became the fence around my life. I fed it with worry. I tightened my belt and watched the world spin. I became expert at small economies, skipping lunches, delaying repairs, choosing the cheapest route. My car old. Coffee always gave up in the worst places, and each time I pushed it back to life, I felt my own chest give a small, bitter cough. The calls from the bank were a slow percussion. I learned the tone of panic. They rattled through my mornings like wind through a thin window. The mortgage was 3 months late. The heating bill waited like a patient I could not afford to heal. My son needed help with school fees. My ex wanted the sum I didn't have. Every call made the apartment smaller. I slept sitting up sometimes, as if a slouch could hold the world at bay. My breath came short. My hands itched with the habit of counting. I worked in a soft-lit office. The monitors hummed a background of neutral gray. Clients trusted me with numbers they could not miss. I managed payrolls, tax returns, tiny businesses clinging to life. I was the quiet engine behind other people's certainty. By day I looked like the answer. By night I felt like a question that nobody had time to solve. My life had a professional polish and an interior rust. Routine became a prison. I repeated gestures until they hardened into beliefs. I folded my money into a thin wallet and kept it in the drawer like a relic. I checked it at odd hours, as if proximity could prevent loss. I rehearsed phrases of denial, "It's okay," "next month," until they tasted hollow. Those routines made me safe and, paradoxically, invisible. They left no room for surprise. One Friday, I came home early. The corridor light was off. The apartment smelled of cooling plaster and old paper. My keys slipped in the lock more like a habit than an action. The room felt too large for my solitude. I sat on the sagging couch and listened to the building breathe. I pressed my palms flat against the fabric, feeling the thread pattern of worry. I remember looking through the window at the first star pricking the navy. The sky was a flat sheet, then a scatter. My chest tightened for a different reason, not only money, but something else that looked like meaning. I tilted my head, and my gaze snagged on a point of light that didn't blink the way the stars do. It wasn't an airplane. It didn't trace a line. It held still, patient, as if looking back. There was a hum small, high, a needle in the night. I thought of electricity, of old wiring. I thought of migraines. I thought of late nights and too much coffee. I tried to rationalize and failed. The sound grew into pressure behind my ears. It made my teeth vibrate. I felt the hair at the back of my neck lift, like static. If this story is reaching you from a small channel, know this: I am not a showman. I share this because what happened rewired how I move in the world. If you want more of these slow, strange accounts, consider subscribing. Help me reach 1,000 subscribers so more people can hear the kind of things that shift a life. Tell me where you're watching from, city, country, and stay with me a while longer. That night, the point of light grew. It resolved into a soft, blue-violet pulse beyond the glass. It felt as if someone had placed a fingertip on the world and was listening for an answer. My throat closed. I thought, briefly, of calling Mauricio my oldest friend because people need witnesses. I imagined his laugh. He would call it stress and give me a practical solution, as always. I sat and did nothing, because sometimes the smallest action is to wait and see. The point of light moved with a deliberateness I couldn't map. It slid down until it rested opposite my window, framing the street in that odd hue. My phone, face down on the table for days, buzzed and vibrated in time with that pulse. It was a small noise, a notification that shouldn't have mattered. I felt my body pivot toward the corridor like a compass needle. I rose. The floorboards complained. The air in the hallway had a temperature I couldn't name, between warmth and cool, like standing on the border of two climates. My skin prickled, breath shallow, palms damp. My heartbeat spliced the silence. I touched the door frame and felt a faint vibration run through the wood, as if something vast and calm had coughed on the other side of reality. I peered into the corridor. Light throbbed and painted the walls in bruised indigo. The hair on my arms stood up. I called out, the sound small and honest. "Is anyone there?" The hallway answered with its own hum, and something else, an impression of presence, so intimate it felt like an echo from inside my own head. I stepped forward. The next moment would change everything, and something inside me both feared and needed that change. I woke to a high, thin ring inside my skull. The clock blinked 3:33. The sound wasn't outside. It sat between my thoughts, sliding along the ridge of my concentration. I rubbed my eyes. The corridor light was not the yellow bulb I knew. It was a slow, pulsing blue-violet that filled the corners with soft shadows. My voice felt fragile when I said, "Hello." It broke on the second syllable. The air at the entrance felt denser. My lips tasted metallic. My skin tingled in small, even waves, first on my forearms, then across the scalp. The temperature crept and retreated like a tide. At the center of the living room stood a figure. Not the pop-sci creature I expected from films. Not grotesque. It was human in outline, too tall, too slim, but its edges shimmered like heat above asphalt. The body was a suggestion of form wrapped in a moving skin of light. The light breathed, slow as if it had lungs. When I sat down, my legs gave up as if I had been wrenched of balance. The sofa swallowed me, and I became small. The figure didn't step closer. It didn't need to. The space between us held a pressure that felt like the hush before a crowded room exhales. Then its voice came, not through my ears, but inside the place where language meets thought. It was neither male nor female, ancient and immediate. The words landed like pebbles in a pond, and the ripples were my own feelings. "Your fear of scarcity created scarcity," it said. The phrase had weight. It sounded like water shaping stone. My mind tried to spool a reply and failed. It felt like answering a mirror. I managed, "Horse, who? What are you?" The figure tilted its head with a small, precise motion. Its eyes, if you can call them, that held a depth I felt behind my ribs. Nebulae seemed folded in those pupils. "I am a reflection of what you feed," it said. "I am what you called with belief, even the belief of disbelief. The question is not who I am. The question is what you will look at now." I was a professional of certainty, and yet everything certain in that room loosened. The walls seemed porous. The wallpaper's faded pattern pulsed in time with the light. The air smelled faintly of ozone and old paper. My breath was a small bell. I could feel the slow surrender of my rational mind, and, beneath it, a curious hunger. The figure moved its hands. The motion was a slow, eloquent punctuation. The temperature in the room shifted in a bandwidth, a fingertip of heat, a cool ribbon across my cheek. The sound of the street outside dimmed as if the world had been slid behind a thicker curtain. I noticed my fingers unclench on the couch arm. The muscles around my jaw slackened. "Why me?" I whispered. "Why now?" The voice inside my head answered with a pattern like an old lesson returning in a new language. "You asked without knowing you asked. You rehearsed loss until the world matched your rehearsal. I came because intent calls, even when intent is a complaint." A tremor ran through me, part fear, part recognition. A woman with a steady voice explained a correction had been made to my account, an old error reversed. Some fees adjusted. My debt lowered. Numbers, which had once felt like hollow thunder, became a small, tangible step toward breathing. I let out a laugh that was part disbelief, part relief. The laugh surprised me. It came from somewhere old, where worry had been given its due, then released. The figure watched. Its light dimmed and brightened like a slow nod. Coincidence, I said quickly, trying to hold on to logic like a raft. Coincidence is a word for a closed mind, it replied softly. There is frequency. Your inner state is a current. It gathers forms. My hands were warm on my knees. My chest unclenched a little more. I felt a small, bright thread of possibility. If a thought could bring a phone call, what else lay in that current? If frequency mattered, did words change more than bills? If so, how to speak them without desperation? Try this, it suggested. Make a rupture. Show the current you are willing to let flow. I understood in a way that scraped at fear. A rupture, something radical to break the script. My fingers opened, brushed the drawer where I kept a small roll of cash, $320. The number felt both tiny and sacred. I had saved it against nights like this. I had folded it in careful, trembling ways. Burn it, the light said. My gut shut. Are you asking me to burn my last money? That is lunacy, I said aloud, feeling the absurdity of the scene. The room smelled of paper and ozone. It is symbol, the figure replied. The symbol holds your fear. The symbol binds the river. Release the sign, and you release the grip. Circulation must be proven. My palms sweat. The act felt like betrayal and like absolution. I thought of my son, of the mortgage, of the shame my father taught me to cradle. I thought of the odd comfort of the wallet, thick with smallness and imposing as armor. To set it alight was to unmake a safety I had relied on. My hands found a small metal bowl. I put the bills inside. My thumb shook on the lighter. The flame asked nothing of me but a simple presence. I struck it, and the tiny fire licked the paper. The smell of burned ink rose and hit a place inside my throat that had been packed down for years. I said the words first as parody, then with a strange fidelity. I release the fear that holds my money. I allow abundance to flow through me. I am not my lack. I said it again. I felt the vibration of the sentence go down my spine. A small space opened in me where desperation had been. The notes curled, blackened, and fell into ash. The sound was small, like an old door finally unlatching. Sleep, the voice said. Observe. I did. The night widened, and the light in the corridor thinned to a soft bloom. I lay awake until dawn, fascinated and frightened by the empty sleeve of my wallet. The world moved anyway, the same birds, the same trucks distant as low thunder. Morning arrived as if it had always been coming for me. When I left the building to buy bread, the sidewalk gave me a small gift, a $50 bill tucked under a park bench as if someone had placed it there for me to find. My chest did that odd thing it does when grief and joy mix. Later that afternoon, a former client called about overdue returns. They wanted me to prepare paperwork and were willing to pay for service. The amount was modest but precise. My son called to say he had found stable work. These were small currents at first, then more consistent ripples. That night, my friend Mauricio confronted me. He pushed his coffee cup aside and leaned forward with a flat, practical stare. Raphael, listen. Alien lights? Burning money? You need a doctor, he said. But there was something else in his voice, fear for me, maybe, or worry about my reputation. How do you explain the bank? I asked. The call? The bills? The timing? Coincidences, he said, an answer that tried to fix everything into a harmless, sensible shape. Stress makes patterns where none exist. It's simple psychology. I wanted him to see the light in my hands, the hush it brought. I wanted to hand him a piece of ash and have him taste the change. Instead, his words pushed a cold wedge into my certainty. Doubt crept back. For a moment, I almost wanted to retreat into the comfort of the old map. But that night, I closed my eyes and felt something shift with the weight of finality. The ash in the bowl was an honest witness. The voice in my head, the figure outside my rituals, the small miracles that followed all of it threaded together into a single question. Would I accept that my internal world could shape the external, or would I shrink back to the safe, known grammar of cause and effect? I chose, with a trembling that felt like life, to keep testing. The light's presence did not stay. It hovered on the edge of things like the memory of a song. I am here when you call by living differently, it said before folding away into the architecture of the room. I sat alone then and felt the slow, odd relief of someone who had broken a pattern and noticed that the floor remained steady. My hands were cleaner than they'd been in years, not from literal dirt, but from the grit of old scripts. I could feel possibility like a pulse under the skin. When I finally slept, the last thought that hummed before sleep took me was not an old fear. It was a simple loop, a tiny phrase I found myself saying like a prayer and a promise. I let go. I allow abundance. I become the channel. For 3 hours the room became a separate weather system. The air hummed like a distant transformer and then smoothed into silk. My skin tasted faintly of metal. Light moved across the plaster in slow pulses, as if the wall were breathing beneath its paint. He called himself Elio. The name arrived inside me without sound, like a tide returning. He did not stand so much as unfold. His outline was human, but the edges dissolved into the blue-violet bloom behind him. When he raised a hand, the light caught on the faint dust in the air, and it looked like a constellation sliding under a lamp. "Look with having," he said, and the sentence landed like a pebble in my chest. I knew immediately that it was an instruction, not a suggestion. The voice was close and far at once, like your own thoughts slowed down so you could watch its gears. I pointed to the cracked wall out of habit. I expected to name what was broken. Instead, my eyes softened and the cracks shifted into lines of possible repair. I saw a painter's breath in a small apartment that smelled of sawdust and lemon. I saw laughter. The paint was a color I could not name. It held noon and evening at once. My body registered the image before my mind accepted it. Heat pooled behind my sternum. My shoulders dropped an inch. It felt like finding a door I had always passed without seeing. The sound of the street, the clatter of a distant bus, dimmed. The room folded inward and left a clean center. Elio's fingers described a slow arc, and my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I reached for it with a curious, almost embarrassed eagerness. A bank number. I answered with a voice that surprised me, quieter, reverent. "The system corrected an error," said a woman. Her words were ordinary and precise. She listed figures and dates, and then a smaller number than before. 30%. She said it like a fact, not a miracle. Numbers settled in my ear like stones in a bowl. I let the phone go. The plastic felt warm. The world resumed color, and yet the blue-violet seam behind everything remained a shadow of possibility. I told myself it was coincidence. My mouth made the word and then tasted it like iron. "There is no coincidence," Elio said. He did not argue. He placed an image in me instead, a river clogged with leaves. When you refuse circulation, the water finds a locked bed. Open the lock. I tried to test the phrase as one tests a new key. I named small things aloud. My son's job, a client, a utility bill. Saying them made the air thrum differently. It was almost musical. Saying them with a different feeling, with the small, calm certainty I felt when the walls softened sent a different note through the house. My hands were warm on my knees. I felt a tiny thread of courage like a wire through my palms. The idea came like a bright, sharp blade through fog. Belief was not a private superstition. It was a tuning fork. Whatever I struck sent reverberations outward. "Teach me," I said simply. I had not meant for it to be a command, but it landed that way. Elio's light tightened, and his voice became a pattern of breaths. "You will act where thought has been idle. You will make a rupture." I didn't know yet how violent or how gentle that rupture would be. I only knew it would. The idea of burning what I had saved felt absurd in a way that scraped like sand. "Light it," he said. The lighter's will chirped. Flame asked nothing of me but a small focus. I struck it, and the little yellow tongue rose, trembled, and touched the corner of the top bill. Paper curled, smoke rose, and the smell was immediate: ink and ash, memory burning into clean air. My lungs filled with the old habit of clutching. I wanted to snatch it back like a child whose toy was taken away. He coached me with a cadence. "Breathe, watch, release." His voice in my head was steady. "Say the line," he said. I said the line aloud, first in mockery, then in a strange, gathering sincerity. I released the tight fist. I opened my hands. Abundance is motion, not hoarding. The words felt ridiculous, and then like a small engine starting. The bills browned and then blackened. The flame licked the last edge. Ash fell into the bowl with the soft, honorable sound of something finally surrendering. Where panic should have been, a window of light opened inside me. My chest unclenched as if a hand had been removed. I slept badly that afternoon, and then rested like someone who had stepped over a line and found the other side softer. Elio's presence thinned to a small pulse at the edge of the room. "Observe," he said before he receded. "Track the current." Within hours the world began to answer in small, precise ways. I walked to buy bread and found a $50 bill folded under a public bench, warm from the sun. My fingers closed around it like receiving a small benediction. Later a long-standing client called. They wanted help regularizing old tax returns and offered a payment that had been promised but held up for months. The number was $800, modest but immediate. My son called with news. A local firm had offered him a part-time position with a schedule he could manage. His voice sounded relieved. The relief ran like a new current through me. Each small event was a note. They did not add up to all I had given, but they were not meant to in that moment. They were proof of movement. The balance between loss and replenishment altered my internal scale. That night, I repeated a short phrase in the dark before sleep. "I am the channel, not the tank." It was awkward at first, then steady. The phrase landed in my belly and warmed like tea. I let it become a loop. Over and over. I am the channel, not the tank. I am movement, not measure. The next day, strange confidence took root. I called a woman I knew at the legal firm where I had once freelanced. I did not rehearse. I said simply that I had capacity and asked if there was anything pending. Her laugh surprised me. It was soft and practical. She forwarded my name. The afternoon produced an email from an old employer about a miscalculation in retro pay, the kind of clerical ghost that sometimes returns with interest. My heart hit a rhythm that felt less like panic and more like readiness. I walked into an ordinary grocery store and found myself smiling at a cashier. She smiled back. A stranger's kindness landed on me like small change. These small returns did not erase fear, but they shifted its weight. The act of burning had not been a theatrical surrender. It had been a demonstration. I had made space in the current. Loop affirmative I. I let go. I allow more. I let go. I allow the flow. I repeated it until it felt like inhaling. And yet, in the middle of the rise, the world pressed back. A neighbor asked me, casually, what I had done with my savings. A thoughtless question sharpened into real consequence. Rumors travel. People notice change. Before I could avoid it, I decided I needed a witness who could hold the experience without mythologizing it. I called Mauricio. Mini cliffhanger. I told Mauricio everything. I had not expected his next move. Mauricio met me at our usual cafe with the same square posture he kept at audits. He smelled of strong coffee and certainty. His hands were clasped around a cup like an anchor. "Raf," he said, leaning forward, eyebrows a ledger line of doubt. "Describe what happened." "Precisely." I described Elio the way you describe an accident. What you could see, what you could not, and the smell of burnt paper. I told him about the bank call, the bench bill, the client. I told him the phrase I repeated like a talisman. Mauricio listened the way he had always listened, with the scalpel of practicality in his mouth. When I finished, he placed his cup down and tapped it with a finger. Hallucination, he said, the single word like a verdict. Stress, sleep deprivation. You burn money out of symbolic desperation. Then confirmation bias found the rest. Stories make patterns. His voice clanged inside me. The cafe noise folded inward. For the first time since the light entered my life, I felt myself small again, not from lack of money, but from the old grammar of being judged sane. But the bank, the legal email, the bill, I tried. Dates, phone calls, clerical errors, he said. He blinked like someone who had had to repeat a simple problem to a child. You can't build a life on extraordinary interpretations of ordinary events. His certainty hit something raw. There was rage, briefly, like a tightened muscle. There was also shame. I sat with both. In the silence, doubt seated itself like frost. When I left, the street smelled of rain and hot asphalt. I felt tired in a way debt never made me. What if he were right? What if I had simply created an elaborate fiction to comfort myself? The memory of the lit money in motion felt both radical and criminal. At home, the apartment carried the ordinary sounds. The radiator, a distant television, the small hum of the refrigerator. I called for Elio more out of habit than hope. The blue-violet seam did not appear. Silence answered with its familiar weight. I walked the rooms like a man checking for doors that might no longer exist. Sleep did not come easily. I lay listening to my breath, the slow metronome of doubt. I felt the old scripts returning: tighten, hoard, count, guard. My hands found the hollow of the ash bowl in the drawer, as if to touch proof. The ash was dull black and strangely comforting. It was a relic and a promise. Morning brought gray light and the small, modern terror of bills on the doormat. I sat at the table and breathed. I remembered Elio's voice, which never scolded but asked for proof instead. He wanted practice. He wanted a life moved. So I made a decision that felt like both rebellion and sanity. Not to prove Elio to Mauricio, but to myself. To live according to this new tuning for 24 hours. To check the signals without needing to rescue them into meaning. I began small. I told a client yes before the part of me that measured risk had its full list. I left a larger tip for a barista whose hands trembled. I sent my son a message of gratitude instead of worry-laced advice. Each small choice was a tiny vote against the old grammar. Throughout the day, I repeated a new loop. I am the current. I am open. It was shorter now. I am current. I said it as I opened the email from the firm and saw the subject line about retro pay. My stomach did an odd flip. I opened it as if reading a test result. There it was, confirmation of the miscalculation. The language was dry and legal. The number, when I allowed myself to read it, was larger than my apartment's mortgage and smaller than the relief that came through my ribs. It was not final. It required process and patience, but it was undeniably real. I stood and looked out of the window. The city was flat and ordinary and also altered. For a moment, I thought I saw the faintest echo of Elio in the reflection of the glass, a suggestion, not proof. My hands were steady. Mauricio's skepticism did not vanish. It was not meant to. The world needed both measures, the skeptic to hold us honest and the other voice to move us when the measures failed to account for living. The real test was not to silence Mauricio, but to continue despite him if my inner barometer remained true. That night I wrote a sentence in my journal I had not admitted aloud. I will act on this new tuning even if I look foolish. The sentence felt like a vow. It tasted of iron and clean water. Mini cliffhanger. I had a choice: retreat into the old ledger or double down on the current. I picked a step forward, and the next days would demand everything it meant. I woke on the fourth morning with the taste of rain in my mouth and a steadiness I had not felt in months. The radiator hummed like a distant engine. Sunlight made a thin bar across the table. I sat there, palms warm on the wood, and decided I would not let Mauricio's doubt become my weather. I prepared the ritual as if it were a lab test. I closed the windows, I steadied my attention, and waited. 3 days slid by with ordinary domesticness. I walked the same streets, bought the same bread. Each day I resaed the loop once in the morning and once before sleep. The loops became a kind of breath. I opened to enough. I am the canal for enough. My posture shifted. My shoulders lost their old map of tension. On the morning of the 4th day, an email arrived. The subject line was spare, my name, a case number. My hands hesitated as if someone had set a stone on my palm. I opened it. A law firm I had worked for years ago, a small contractual ghost, had discovered a miscalculation. They had recalculated retroactive benefits and settled. The number they listed for me was larger than any number I'd seen in my life. 800,000. I read it twice. The screen blurred with light. My chair creaked. My lungs forgot to keep time. I did what anyone would do. I touched my face, then my chest, as if looking for evidence of waking. Tears came first, small, sudden, honest. They tasted like salt and relief. Sound in the apartment folded into the single note of my breath. I laughed softly, a sound half joy, half surprise. I called my son and heard his voice catch. His voice sounded lighter and different, as if some weight had been moved from both of us. I did not parade the number. I sat with it like with a delicate instrument. I paid immediate allocations, the mortgage, the overdue accounts, the debt collector's demands. I made no theatrical vows. I wrote a simple list and checked items off with a pen that sounded firmer than my usual hand. Then, in the hush after the practicalities, I looked toward the window and saw a reflection so faint I might have imagined it a violet outline that could have been a trick of glass and light. I thought of Elio for the first time as something other than visitor, as an index, a method shown. My body relaxed into a space that had been closed for years. I let that relaxation be a test, too. If the money had come because of a clerical error, then the error had been an opening. If it had come because of a frequency, the frequency had shifted. Either way, I felt the hinge move. The old grammar of scarcity had loosened. I tasted the possibility of a new syntax. I slept with my hands unclenched. I woke with the same loops in my mouth and a quiet question. What now, when the proof lay in the bank and not only in ritual? The next part of the experiment would not be about making money reappear. It would be about changing the way I handled it, how I let it move through me. That choice would test the lesson deeper than any deposit could. Mini cliffhanger. I would discover that the way I used the money mattered as much as the way it had arrived. The nights after the deposit were quieter, though not empty. I noticed small things I had missed when survival was all I saw. The texture of the coffee at dawn, the soft fabric of my son's jacket when he visited, the way light rested on the kitchen tiles like patience. I found myself practicing a new economy of attention. Elio's presence was like a radio station that slowly fades once loud, now only a signal in the background of my day. His phrases returned not as commands, but as calibrations. Reality answers to frequency, he had said. I began to test that not as theory, but as method. I started with language. I created short, repeatable sentences for the inner room of my mind. I found verbs that fit my hands. I made a loop that felt like a seam I could stitch into waking life. I let it flow through me. I do not hold. I said it while handing the cashier a tip larger than usual. I said it when I set aside funds for repair instead of tucking them into a secret drawer. The loops were not incantations. They were habits. I also created an external phrase how I spoke to money in the world. When negotiating, I began with clarity instead of fear. I would say, "This is what I offer and why it matters," and then listen without shrinking. Before that, talk about money in my presence had always pitched toward scarcity. Now it stayed level, honest. My tone shaped the room. Slowly, outcomes shifted in kind. A former client paid ahead with a note of gratitude. A supplier waived a small fee after I asked plainly and without apology. My son, freed from some of his burden, rearranged his schedule and visited more. A neighbor, for reasons I could not fully explain, handed me a plant and said, "We all need new growth." These were not miracles like the email. They were small returns of a changed posture. They were proof that circulation had neighbors. Health followed finance in its own way. I slept deeper. The tension that had lived between my shoulder blades, a geological fault line from years eased. My breath lengthened in the middle of the day, and with that length came patience. I found space to call an old friend and apologize for times I had been too busy managing fear to be present. The friend replied with a laugh and an invitation. Relationships began to reweave. I gave 2 real examples to solidify the reality of these patterns. A woman I coached in small business shifted a fixed-fee model to a sliding scale, and within months her bookings doubled. A neighbor with chronic back pain who had once joked about remedies adopted a short breathing practice I shared and reported less morning stiffness within a week. These were ordinary people making ordinary changes that produced visible ripples. That is the scale at which true law works, quietly, in daily acts. But illumination was not solely comfort. It came with responsibility. Elio's quieter voice reminded me of a paradox. Abundance asks you to widen, not to hoard. He did so with a laconic line that stayed with me. Keep the gate open. The river will not stop to worship your bridge. It is poetic and stern. It required choices to spend, to give, to invest in places that would not immediately pay me back, to risk being generous. I created a practical protocol. Each week, I would allocate funds in 3 streams: sustain, grow, and circulate. Sustain covered my life. Grow funded ventures and learning. Circulate was my deliberate offering to others: small loans to a neighbor, a scholarship for a local course, free consultations for a struggling entrepreneur. The Circulate Fund was not charity in the old sense. It was an experiment in rhythm. I watched it return in altered forms: gratitude, referrals, community resilience. There were moments of doubt, of course. I would catch myself measuring outcomes, tempted to revert to accounting as defense. In those moments I used a short internal script. I am the conduit. I do not clutch. The phrase steadied me. It was different from bravado. It felt like a spine. Elio's final teachings were not metaphysical lectures, but practical retunings. He guided me to translate feeling into procedure. Design your gravity, he said once, in that gentle, alien cadence, so others may orbit without crashing. He did not give me formulas. He handed me practices. Speak with clarity. Make the first move when generosity is due. Set rules for money that reflect life rather than fear. The deposits, the reimbursements, the healed relationships, they mattered. But the greater work was how I arranged my days around a new frequency. I rehearsed 3 short loops that became my daily spine, each in the first person and original to the experiment. Morning loop, aloud. I open the gate. I trust the river. Midday loop, whispered. I direct, I do not cling. Night loop, internal. I steward what flows through me. These phrases were small, almost silly at first. Repeating them tightened a muscle that had grown slack from years of guarding. The muscle was trust. Mini cliffhanger. Elio's visit would shrink to a single object left on my table, a reminder that the lesson was mine to embody or to forget. The final afternoon, Elio appeared as soft as a memory. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon and wet concrete from a rain earlier. His outline gathered at the edge of the kitchen light, and then narrowed until he was simply a pattern of violet behind my eyes. He placed a small crystal on my table, as if setting down a settled thing. It was the size of a pebble and faceted like an old window. When I touched it, the air seemed to hold its breath. The prism pulsed faintly, not with spectacle, but with an insistence I could feel at the base of my throat. It was not a talisman you wore. It was an anchor you returned to. Elio's voice was no louder than thought. Keep this as a reminder, he said. Not of me, but of the work. The prism is a habit. Touch it, remember to circulate. There was a softness and an urgency in the sentence. Then he receded, leaving. These were small restorations, but they mattered because they were honest. They were not spectacle, they were repair. I also discovered I was not writing a unique story into the world. At a town meeting, a woman told a tale of a night she woke and listened to a sound she could not name. A plumber spoke of a dream that led him to redesign his schedule and, because of that, reconnect with his daughter. A former colleague offered a quiet handshake and said, "Something shifted here, Raphael. I don't know how, but you look like you've stopped carrying the rain." Their stories echoed mine without copying it. The phenomenon had neighbors. The pattern repeated, small acts, repeated, attention redirected, circulation honored. Before Elio faded completely, he gave one last instruction that felt practical and stern. Teach the method, not the miracle. He did not leave examples of miracles to imitate. He left a method, a habit of speech, a set of small rituals, and the crystal as a physical nudge. The point was not to replicate a single extraordinary payout. The point was to alter the grammar so that life could answer differently. I began to teach in the way the lesson had been given to me through short practices and sensory tasks. Breathe into your ledger, touch something that reminds you to circulate, say the loop aloud before a transaction. I asked people to report back in everyday measures. Did you sleep better? Did a client respond differently? Did a relationship ease? The answers were simple and real. People shifted their stance and watched their world rearrange. There is humility in this work. I learned to guard against rhetorical expansion, meaning I avoided grand claims. When someone asked me if the crystal guaranteed anything, I would smile and say, "No, the crystal asks you to remember. The rest is practice." I cautioned against promises that sound like shortcuts. I encouraged vigilance and responsibility. The inner work matters. So does the paperwork. At night, I put the prism on my nightstand. It still pulsed faintly when I brushed it with my thumb. Sometimes I would whisper to it the loops I used. I open the gate. I trust the river. Each repetition stitched the lesson tighter into my days. I found joy in the repetition itself, the way a gardener returns to the plot each morning. Years on, the story of the email and the burned money is a hinge in my telling, a remarkable hinge. Yes, but the heart of the matter is the aftercare, how we build a life that honors flow. The cosmic strangeness was the invitation, the work was mine. I chose to answer. I still look at the night sky sometimes. Not to prove the presence of anything particular, but to remember scale. The lesson from Elio, whether he was another being or a depth of my own consciousness, was the same. Reality is porous if we learn to be channels rather than containers. When someone asks what they should do first, I give one instruction that is practical and immediate. Find one small thing to let go of today, and when you do, say aloud, "I am the canal." Then watch. This is not magical thinking. It is practice. Change will show up in measures that make sense: sleep, conversation, business. If you want a single line to carry into your life, borrow mine and make it your own. Final image. The prism on my table decomposes sunlight into colors I cannot name. It is beautiful and not mysterious. It is a tool. Mini cliffhanger. Sometimes, late, the light bends in the prism, and I hear a phrase I did not teach myself, which suggests the lesson continues, and there are more rooms to open. At night, I hold the prism between my fingers and watch the light split. It fractures into colors that my tongue cannot name, like a language the eye knows before the mouth. The crystal sits cool against my palm. The apartment is quiet except for the distant traffic and the slow, trusting breath I now practice. When I press the prism with my thumb, it answers with a faint pulse, a tiny insistence at the base of my throat, not a promise, only a reminder. I still feel the weight of what happened, but the weight has a new shape. It is not the burden of survival alone. It is a hinge. I wake to sound differently now. The morning light through the kitchen blinds reads to me like a ledger of possibility. The tile under my feet counts nothing but steadiness. The same phone that once meant calls about overdue accounts rings sometimes with mundane kindness. A neighbor asking if I can recommend someone, my son with a story about work, a client who says thank you and means it. The ordinary has returned, but retuned. I keep the rituals simple. Before I open my inbox, I breathe in 4 slow counts, hold for 3, exhale for 6. I touch the prism and whisper my midday line. I open the gate. I trust the river. I say it aloud in the cashier's line when I hand over payment. It sounds odd the first dozen times. Then it begins to sound like the posture of a person who expects things to circulate rather than to solidify. The work I build now is modest and stubborn. I pay myself a living wage. I hire slowly. I keep a 3-stream budget. Sustain, grow, circulate. The circulate stream is not charity theater. It is tiny loans to neighbors, a free afternoon each month for someone who needs help with books, a subsidized spot in a workshop. The money moves. So do the stories around me. People sleep better. A bakery owner changes his hours and gets to see his child in the morning. A woman I mentored shifts her pricing and can hire an assistant. These aren't miracles in the headline sense. They are the arithmetic of attention. I teach what I learned the way I received it, through sensory tasks and short scripts. I ask people to do 3 things in a row: feel, speak, then act. Sit quiet for 2 minutes and feel the chest. Say once, I am the canal. Do one small thing that forces circulation. Pay an invoice early. Give time away. Let a possession leave your hands. Do this 3 days in a row. Report back in sleep quality and conversation tone. The evidence is ordinary and accumulates. There is a practical grammar that came from those months with LEO phrases I now keep in my pocket like tools. In public I use clear sentences. This is my offer, and this is the outcome I expect. Internally, when fear creeps in, I steady myself with 3 loops that I invented for this work. Morning, aloud. I open the gate. I trust the river. Midday, whispered. I direct. I do not cling. Night, internal. I steward what flows through me. Each line occupies 3 breaths. Each line shifts the body before the world rearranges. If you want one exercise to try tonight, do this. Place any small object in your hand: a coin, a stone, a key. Close your eyes. Breathe in 4, hold 3, out 6. Say quietly, I am the canal. Then set the object somewhere visible. Do not fetishize the object. Let it be a nudge. Watch the next 72 hours for small returns: a phone call, a found bill, a short message of thanks. The returns will be credible. They will be human. I learned to protect the practice from my own storytelling. People ask if the prism guarantees outcomes. I say no. The prism is not a talisman. It is an anchor to habit. The guarantee is the repeated action of retuning attention. That is why I also insist on paperwork and margins. Faith without account is fantasy. Faith with systems is stewardship. Sometimes I place the prism on my bedside table and whisper a loop just before sleep. The pulse is dim, but it is there. Sometimes, late, the light bends and a phrase touches me that I did not teach myself. It is brief and untranslatable, like the aperture of another room opening. I always listen. That is the small cliff. The lesson continues to arrive in fragments, and there are more rooms to open. Thank you for sitting with this story. If you found it useful, share where you are reading from in the comments, city and country, and consider subscribing. Each new subscriber helps this work reach 1,000 people learning small, accountable ways to circulate. The changes are not spectacular. They are patient. They happen in the texture of sleep and in the way a neighbor hands you a plant. They happen in the sound of a laugh that returns to my son's voice. They happen when I choose to be the conduit rather than the container. The last lesson Elio left me with was not an instruction about money, but about posture. Widen, do not hoard. Before I turn the light off, I do the tiny meditation I teach. I breathe long. I hold the prism once, then set it down. I say my final loop aloud into the dark. I am the canal. I let it flow through me. The words are simple. They are like a key I use nightly to unlock the same old room in a new way. Sometimes, very late,